Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you with us today for what I believe will be a very interesting Ethics Matters lecture. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Javi Moraim, a colleague and friend, amongst us today. Dr. Moraim is an academician, attorney, and active mediator for both civil and family matters, with cases ranging across healthcare and beyond. Dr. Moraim brings a distinctive perspective to healthcare conflict resolution. For over 30 years, she has been a medical school professor, focusing on health law and bioethics, and practicing mediation on the wards. Dr. Moraim works in the clinical settings, regular rounds and conferences with faculty and physicians in training. This has permitted an ongoing first-hand view of the day-to-day challenges, conflicts, and nuances that arise for patients, families, physicians, nurses, and other members of the healthcare team. Dr. Moraim is also an active scholar and a sought-after speaker, believe me. She has authored 2 books and over 140 articles in journals of law, medicine, and bioethics, including the California Law Review, the Vanderbilt Law Review, Tort and Insurance Law Journal, New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, Journal of Medicine, Journal of Health Matrix, Archives of Internal Medicine, Hastings Center Report, and others. She has also presented hundreds of invited lectures nationally and internationally, and this is the first time Dr. Moraim is in the Middle East. In her talk today, Dr. Moraim will discuss the important issue of error disclosure and how they are changing the med-mal or medical malpractice landscape for the better. And this is so by addressing what patients, physicians, and the healthcare system actually need. I take the opportunity to remind you of the Regional Conference on Medical Malpractice, Error and Disclosure, which will take place on Saturday, the 31st. Dr. Moraim will be the keynote speaker there, and I'm sure you will see her talks are simply captivating. So welcome, Dr. Moraim.
Thank you. It is an honor and truly a pleasure to be here. The hospitality which I have enjoyed is memorable, and I am so delighted to be here. And I wanted to say something, and close your ears, Talia, okay, because you're going to be embarrassed. I just wanted to emphasize to you that coming from America, I am so impressed and delighted to say what an extraordinary bioethics program that Dr. Arawi and colleagues have put together here. It is top flight. And I think it can help you and appreciate that, to hear it from somebody who has nothing to gain or lose by saying that. It is top flight. And Dr. Arawi and colleagues are to be enthusiastically commended. Thank you for your kind invitation here. I wanted to start out by saying that I've been interested in medical errors. I've been on the wards in a clinical setting for a very long time, okay? Since, okay, I'll confess it, 1980. All right, okay, I'm really, really old. These gray hairs are earned. And so my teaching is not courses in front of blackboards and whiteboards and things like that. I teach by talking with residents and faculty and students on the wards as we figure out, what are we going to tell Mrs. Brown's family this afternoon at 4 o'clock? Things like that. And one of the things that I've seen all along is how devastated my physician colleagues are when something goes wrong, even if no one made a mistake. And they are devastated when they are sued. Whether or not they feel like they've made a mistake, it is devastating. And I keep thinking to myself, there's got to be a better way, because patients and families also, obviously, find it devastating when something goes wrong. And there's a lot of confusion, and there are a lot of mixed messages and miscommunication when something doesn't turn out as well as hoped for. Everyone makes mistakes. For example, and maybe we do need to dim the lights at the very front here. Here's a dog in the hammock. I have made a terrible mistake. So anyway, some of the research is really pretty clear that when a harm occurs, there are 4 things that patients and families really, really need. One of them is just to find out what happened. It is a deep human need. And sadly, when physicians hear somebody ask, how could this happen? How did this happen? What they hear is, who do I sue? That's really not what patients and families are asking. They need to know what happened. And part of this is just to understand, to make sense of things. We're rational beings, we need to make sense of things. And when things don't make sense, there's a gap there, and we want to fill it. There is also the fact that unequal information can be humiliating. I remember, just watching CNN, they had, after that Malaysian airliner went down a few months ago, they had, in the US anyway, it was wall-to-wall coverage of the airliner and where is it. And one of the things that one of the commentators pointed out was something that I hadn't really put together. That when one side, because the families, as you recall, were saying, well, why didn't the airline tell us what's going on? And a lot wasn't known. So they couldn't tell a lot, but apparently they weren't telling what they did know. And somebody pointed out that it can be humiliating to be in a position of needing to know and somebody else know and they won't tell you. And so it can be embarrassing, it can be humiliating. And that's another reason patients and families need to know. Another thing that people need after something goes badly in healthcare is to find meaning, to improve care. One of the, perfect, thank you so much. That's exactly perfect, thank you. One of the things that happened, a sort of a famous case at Johns Hopkins from a few years ago was the 2-year-old child named Josie King. And Josie went into the hospital for a perfectly routine kind of thing, and one thing led to another. Through the hospitalization, the mother kept saying, something is not right with my child, and they kept reassuring her. And by the time they realized something really was not right with her child, it was too late, and Josie King died. Instead of an ugly, nasty, vicious lawsuit, the family and the hospital collaborated and created an institute for patient safety. There is no redeeming value in the death of a healthy 2-year-old. There is nothing good about that. But what they did was to create something good out of it, to find some meaning and some value that was good for everyone, and including and perhaps especially the people on the healthcare provider side. People say this must not have happened in vain. And it's not just healthcare, and you know that. It's not just healthcare. People need to find value and meaning. Another thing is people need to have their suffering recognized. Just a few weeks ago in the New York Times was an article by a physician who had had an error in treatment, in her own treatment, at a major medical center, and she had to do a lot of follow-up care, coming to the hospital every week, getting painful treatments week after week after week that would not otherwise have happened. And she said in that article that one of the things that she needed the most was that they just recognize that this was a lot of suffering for her and just say, gosh, I'm so sorry you're having to go through this. She needed that acknowledgement that she was going through that. And then finally, to be fairly compensated. If I borrow Talia's favorite blouse and I drew, chocolate ice cream on it, I'm the one who needs to clean it up. If I shouldn't have done that in some way, okay, and it wasn't my fault, because I was responsible for it. So I need to make it right. I need to either clean it up or replace it. And that's just the basic concept of fair compensation. And coming from the United States, where we have had a highly litigious society, rattle a lawyer in front of somebody and they immediately head for the bushes or wherever, okay, it's a scary thing. And I appreciate that. But when compensation is made early on, and I'm going to get there in a few minutes, when compensation is made early on, people are surprised at how little families and patients are asking for. Surprisingly little. And that's something worth keeping in mind. We have some history. Way back in 1984, Dr. David Hilfiker wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I highly commend it. Talia, if you'll help me remember, I will email it to you, and then you can distribute it. He had made, you can call it a mistake, by no means was it negligent. He was caring for a woman who had some women's problems, shall we say, some GYN problems, and 4 negative pregnancy tests. And he said, maybe you could go to, this was in a very remote rural area of Minnesota. And he said, well, you could go to the larger city where they have an ultrasound, way back in '84, just to be sure that you're not pregnant, because he had recommended a dilatation and curettage. And she said, oh no, doctor, I trust you. And then he realized when he was doing the D&C that he was seeing the products of a previously healthy fetus that had been very much wanted. He was completely devastated by the error. And the article talks about how when doctors make a mistake, there was no negligence here, but it was technically an error of judgment of some sort, I suppose, if you want to call it that. Error or not, he was absolutely devastated. And he pointed out, we don't help each other as physicians when something goes badly. We just leave each other, you're put in solitary confinement at the time you most need to talk to somebody about how to heal. He wrote an article, one of them was The Wounded Healer, and then another book later was called Healing the Wounds, about how physicians deal with error. And some of the data shows, of course, they feel guilt, loss of confidence, sleeping difficulties, and so forth. A study of surgeons not long ago, where they made a major error within the last 3 months, over 16% had suicidal ideation. That's serious. And just yesterday evening, hot, off the presses, breaking news, this article from JAMA. And it's a wonderful article. It was written by an anesthesiologist who pointed out, you remember not that long ago, the miracle on the Hudson where Captain Sully Sullenberger, both engines had been taken out by birds and he landed on the Hudson. No one died. No one was hurt in any serious way. It was a complete success, and every single person involved in that had major PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Everybody did. And she points out how nobody, they did not say, oh, Captain Sullenberger, now that you've safely landed the plane, you have another flight tomorrow, show up for duty. No. He had at least 6 months. One of the flight crew never did go back. A lot of them took a lot of time just to regroup and get their act, to get over it, okay? And she points out how physicians may be emotionally devastated by error, and they don't have the opportunity to talk, to regroup, to debrief. It is damaging to physicians. And sometimes she talks about the physician and others in the care team as being the second victim of an adverse outcome, and the third victim is the next patient, who may have a shaky surgeon, or a scared anesthesiologist, or somebody who is nervous about care in the aftermath of that kind of an adverse event. So physicians and healthcare providers need the same things on the whole that patients and families need. They need to find out what happened. What could I have done differently? How could I have made this better? How can I avoid this in the future? They need sometimes reconciliation, sometimes a heart-to-heart talk with the patient and family, who are more than eager to forgive in many cases. And it is part of quality improvement. So when everyone's needs are met, everyone benefits. So how do we address errors and adverse outcomes? Well, lesson number 1, recognizing errors do happen. So this is called Don't Judge Too Quickly. Don't you love that? Okay. So recognize, number 1, errors happen. In this case, it was just an error of communication, okay? You can't fix what you don't acknowledge. In the US, and these are our data, okay? US data, my data. Hospital errors are the 3rd leading cause of death, avoidable death, after heart disease and cancer comes hospital errors. Ooh, that hurts, ouch. So you can't fix errors that you don't acknowledge.
Sag mal, Papa, hab ich dich noch gar nicht gefragt. Wie kommst du eigentlich mit dem neuen iPad zurecht, was wir dir zum Geburtstag geschenkt haben?
Gut.
Mit den ganzen Apps kommst du klar?
Was denn für Apps? Geh mal bitte ein Stück zur Seite. Was denn?
And the name is that. Papa, how do you like your new iPad? Okay. Oh, gosh. This is one of the major themes of in the United States having to do with medical error over the last 15 to 20 years. Name, blame, and shame. Who is the one who caused this? How do we punish that person? This is not helpful. It does not help much of anything. Here's a story from 1999, New York Times. I love this story because it is so poignant. The guy was the anesthesiologist and chief of surgery for a medical group. And okay, it's at the conclusion of surgery. The patient had, of course, had paralytic because he was intubated. And so he reaches into the drawer to get the reversal agent, brings out the syringe, puts it in, and then says, oh dear, oops, more paralytic, not the reversal agent. And then he looked in the drawer and realized, wait a minute, here's the reversal agent, here's the paralytic. They were identical syringes, except for some teeny tiny little bitty letters on the side, right next to each other in the same drawer. That doesn't make sense, okay? So he goes back to the doctor's lounge and he tells them, boy, I just made a mistake. The patient wasn't hurt. All was well in the end. So, it got reversed. Okay, no harm, no foul. But he said to his colleagues, man, I just made this mistake. And whoa, that was a close one. And his colleague said, oh yeah, that happens all the time. I did it just last week. And they said, yeah, I did it a couple of times in the last few months. Why do we keep doing the same thing over and over? Doesn't it make sense to say, oops, and how do we make it safer? One of the really strong hallmarks of patient safety and error management is to figure out really what happened now so that we can understand that errors are almost always the product of a complex network of systems failures. And I forgot to put the Swiss cheese thing in there, but we'll do that later. So here is an example. The name of this video is My Last Day Working at Home Depot. Home Depot is a large warehouse, lumber, hardware, this kind of stuff. Okay. Oop. Didn't quite do it right. Hang on. We'll get it. Okay. Now, the tempting thing here, of course, is to fire the guy who was driving the forklift, okay? I can't think of a dumber approach, frankly. I mean, you roll back. Let me see if, oh no, not quite. Okay, we're going to get there. You roll back. Okay, now take a look here. Look at how high the shelving is stacked with high, heavy things, flimsy shelving. Look at all this junk stored all over the place. Empty pallets here, empty pallets there, more junk here. This is a perfect picture, I think, of systems level problems. I also want to talk to this guy's boss, and I want to talk to him about how is the warehouse run? Is his boss one of these guys who says, do it that way and shut up and don't backtalk? Well, maybe his boss told him, take it down that aisle. And the guy felt he had no choice. Maybe the guy who drove this forklift understood this was going to be a disaster and felt like he didn't have a choice. So we won't prevent this from happening again and again and again until we look at all the crazy stuff that's going on in that video and probably well beyond. So here's something that this is from Washington Times, January 12th, just about a week or two ago, all right? This is a headline having to do with VA pharmacists who had made some mistakes. They made mistakes. And how the headlines, the upshot of this video is we don't still get it here in the United States either, okay? Because the headline here is they're shocked that the pharmacist wasn't severely punished. They made serious or potentially fatal errors dispensing drugs. They weren't even severely disciplined. That's not how you address error. If the guy simply made a mistake and misread something, that's a normal human mistake. And how we address safety and quality of care, basically the last thing you want to do is rely on human hypervigilance. That is a very poor approach to error and punishing people for making a mistake. That's not a good approach. So This is lesson 3. Most errors are fundamentally the product of complex system-level errors, not really individual mess-ups. A lot of times you'll have a sequence of small individual mess-ups, but usually it's a whole lot of them, and it's a faulty system in the end that is responsible in the total analysis for the error. So what's a better approach for treating injured patients fairly, improving care for the future, and helping physicians to provide excellent care? And these are the two that I'm thinking about. Number one, emphasizing and helping your colleagues get more comfortable with systems-based approaches to error and quality and patient safety. And the second one feels a lot less comfortable, and that is honesty, extreme honesty. Way back in the 1980s, there was a Veterans Administration hospital in the United States that began a policy that it called extreme honesty. And anytime they made an error that they realized, yeah, we did make an error, collectively or individually, we goofed, and it hurt someone, they would bring the patient and or family in and say, we want to tell you what happened, and we want to make it right, and we want to improve care. And the funniest thing they discovered, and I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here, but what they discovered was with this policy of extreme honesty, they saved a fortune. Okay, they saved enormous amounts of money in reduced medical malpractice payouts and reduced defense costs from med-mal litigation. They saved a fortune. Other hospitals have now taken the cue, and I'll get there in a second. So here's the first one, reframing our approach. And this is under, looking at systems-based analysis. So here is an example of reframing something that starts out looking icky into something that's much better. Oh, now darn it, I did it again. I gotta get better at this. I love this one. Uplifting. I love that video. It's so much fun. So, okay, under that first heading, systems-based analysis, it's usually, as I'm sure you guys have been discussing among yourselves, it's usually a whole lot of different things, and looking for a culprit. Who's the bad guy is just not helpful. In-house reporting systems are very important, especially in those hospitals that really focus on using an error to advantage or using a bad outcome to learn and make things better. And so there are in-house reporting systems, and with a no-blame approach. Something I do not have a slide for here, but that I use in some of my disclosure trainings for how to disclose adverse outcomes and errors. Just recently, Yale's OBGYN department came out with the results of a multiple-year study on how to improve safety in OBGYN. They had many different approaches that they were using at the same time. They had a patient safety nurse, a lot of different things, and one thing that they did was an anonymous incident reporting system, totally anonymous. In aviation, anybody involved in aviation who sees something, oops, reports to an anonymous system through NASA, not the Federal Aviation System that might, pose possibly getting back to you and dinging you, okay? NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration that flies guys to the moon and back, okay, it's totally separate agency, and they handle the data, so it's more safe to say, I saw an oopsie the other day. Let's see if we can make it safer. And so there are no blame approaches and anonymous disclosure. And then you use RCAs, root cause analyses, to find out all the various things that contributed to the outcome. And so you seek system-level solutions to make errors less likely. And a wonderful example, this came out just a few years ago in the Joint Commission's Journal on Quality and Patient Safety. And I can email that too, so you can spread it out. It's a collection of articles. This was a 16-year-old obstetric patient, first time pregnancy, and she was delivering a child, scared 16-year-old kid, okay? And the nurse in this case had another patient who was 20-something who was in labor to deliver a dead baby, and she knew it was dead. And so we're dealing with a pretty difficult situation. So the nurse had her hands full. And the short version of the story is that as, the 16-year-old needed epidural medication, okay. She also needed some antibiotics, okay. Well, the nurse inadvertently took the bag that was actually what's coming, took the bag that was for the epidural, hung it, and put it in the IV that was intended for the antibiotics. The patient died immediately. Oh gosh. Well, to its credit, the hospital brought in a committee for basically to review exactly what happened. It's a nationally based drug safety committee, step by step what happened. And yeah, fentanyl and bupivacaine went straight into the antibiotics IV. Ouch, the infant was healthy, but our traditional response is shame, how could you? Oh, you stupid, can't you read? This is not helpful. And I'm not going to go into all the details of what they found, but it was a very complex set of things that had happened. One was that, in theory, you think, okay, well, the fentanyl and bupivacaine should not have been in the room until after it had been authorized by the OB for the anesthesia and so forth. The problem had been that just logistically, once the patient got into pain and really needed the IV, or excuse me, the epidural for pain, the problem was that a lot of times they'd call the anesthesiologist, but the OB still hadn't ordered it, and then they'd have to get the OB to order it, and then they'd get the stuff on board, and then they'd call the anesthesiologist. It was just, in other words, it was kind of a mess. It was a disorganized process for getting the orders from the OBs for the epidurals and so forth. So they would just have it there, just have the bag there, so that it would be ready when the order was set, when the anesthesiologist came, and it was a great comfort to the patient just to see it was there when she needed it. So that's where it was. Another problem was the bags were very, very similar in appearance, almost identical. Yes, the epidural meds had a hot pink colored sticker on, and yeah, the nurse missed that. Yep, that's true, she missed it. But another factor was, the day before this day, this particular nurse had worked 2 consecutive shifts. She did not even have time to go home to get a good night's sleep. She caught a few hours of sleep in the hospital and then went right back on duty. And then, of note, the hospital had been giving prizes to whichever nurses could take the most overtime. Good, okay. So this woman was dead on her feet, caring for a terrified 16-year-old and a grieving woman who was delivering a dead baby, okay? Then we asked, how is it that this mistake was even physically possible? Why was it possible physically to, the interconnectivity of the tubing, to put epidural megs into an IV port? Why not have different connectivity so that you can't? We do this with, at the gas station all the time. I inadvertently one time picked up, the thing for diesel and was trying to put it down the, the gas station. Couldn't, what's the matter with, oh, it's diesel. Oops. Okay, you can't put a diesel thing down to your gas. Okay, you can't. Why is it even possible to do this mistake? We have to recognize people are going to be tired. They're going to be distracted. This is human nature. You don't punish somebody for being tired and distracted. Where penalties are deserved is where people just ignore known safety protocols, where we have, say, a checklist before surgery and somebody says, oh, we don't need no stinking checklist. I know how to read. And they ignore safety protocols or don't bother to wash hands, things like that we know are important for safety. So what happened then was the nurse collapsed at the dead patient's bedside and was admitted for emergency psychiatric treatment while she was heavily medicated and without a lawyer. The hospital took her statement, did not provide her a copy with it, and she sought pastoral care. Her co-workers are invited to come. Administration found out. And so here is this group of nurses who are weeping and sobbing and being escorted by security out into the parking lot. You don't get to be here, lady. You made a mistake. What an awful way to treat somebody who was trying to do the right thing and made a very human error. Based on her statement, she was fired, then criminally indicted. She lost her license. And you think, of all the people who will never make this mistake again, this lady will not make this mistake again. She had been an exemplary nurse for 13 years previously. That's no way to deal with error. That's just not a good way to deal with it. So now we talk about disclosure and offer and communication and resolution programs. They are based on careful internal investigation to discern whether a mistake had been made and whether it could and should have been avoided. Has somebody been careless here or whatever? But it's not, who's the guilty person? What are the things that contributed to the error is the focus. But in disclosure and offer, did we make a mistake somehow that could and should have been avoided? If so, we approach the family and patient with information and assistance. We tell them, this is what we know so far. This is what should have happened. This is what did happen instead, okay? And so we want to make it right. We don't know everything yet. We're going to tell you what we learn as we learn it. We don't want to speculate, and that's really important. You don't want to speculate about this stuff. But we're going to keep you updated, and we want to make care safer. Remember the four things that patients and families need to find value, to make care better. This must not have happened in vain. We're here to tell you we too want to make sure this does not happen in vain, that we learn and improve care on the basis of this adverse outcome. And immediate financial assistance for pressing needs, and for goodness sakes, don't send a bill. If your mistake caused the person harm, don't send a bill. That's usually not going to help. That doesn't matter any. And it's important to make sure that you don't bill somebody for the consequences of an error. Unfortunately, people do get bills and end up paying them fairly often, at least in the US, for consequences of errors. And fair compensation overall. This is what's built into these programs, communication and resolution. So wait a minute, yikes, this is scary. You tell somebody you goofed, oops, ouch, yikes, scary, okay? Aren't they just gonna sue? Well, let me go to an analogy. Way, way, way back in the early 1960s, Donald Oken and colleagues did a study, and this was particularly in oncology, and what they discovered was that their colleagues, over 90%, would never tell the patient the diagnosis of cancer. And basically it was on the assumption that if you tell patients they have cancer, they're gonna jump out the nearest window, they're gonna commit suicide, they're gonna do something horrible. Heaven forbid, people cannot absorb this information. No, 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 keep it quiet. Interestingly, that was kind of on the assumption that people didn't know already or sense that something was drastically wrong. A lot of people have a pretty good sense that something's wrong, and then everybody's going around them. Around that time, in 1961, in the United States, we had a lot of lawsuits having to do with informed consent. I will tell you, I'm a lawyer. I don't practice very actively, but I'm one of them. I'm sorry, don't. Okay, if you brought rotten eggs, please don't throw them now. But I will say the judiciary, the judges, actually contributed a great deal to medical ethics back in those days, because they said, you really need to tell patients what's going on so that they can make an informed consent or refusal. You need to tell them the basics of what's going on. And interestingly, what happened by 15 or so years later, 97% of physicians do tell the patient the diagnosis. There are some exceptions, but people aren't jumping out of windows, and they're showing remarkably greater resilience than physicians had feared. One of the biggest problems, I think, at the time was the same problem that physicians fear today in disclosing errors, and that is, what words do I use? How do I say this? My gosh, you know, it's a scary thing to even think, what words do I put together to say, I made a mistake? And it does matter. And that's one reason why in some of the departments that I work with at UT, I have actually put together a 2-hour training in disclosing adverse outcomes and errors. And we have practice scenarios and so forth that we go through to give them a chance to practice where it's safe. You know, and then the wisdom of their senior mentors and physicians on their experience in disclosing adverse outcomes and so forth. So that's an interesting thing. So now we've actually got some data that the disclosure and offer programs reduce, not raise, at least in the US, incidence and costs of medical malpractice litigation. Saying you're sorry. Now, you know, even if the puppy did something bad, who can feel negatively toward a puppy who's that cute, who says, I'm sorry? Okay. University of Michigan has been one of the long-standing leaders in this, and they have come out with some powerful data. They started their program not long after remember I told you in the 1980s, the Veterans Administration Hospital in Kentucky that started Extreme Honesty. Well, they started theirs, they were on board, fully organized and running by 95, and so this is a set of data in this period, 95 to 2007. Look at how their average monthly rate of new claims fell from over 7 to about 4.5 per 100,000 patients, dropped in half. Average rate, monthly rate of lawsuits fell by 2/3. August of 2002, 220 claims a year. 3 years later, fewer than 100 claims a year. Drastic reductions in expenses like defense costs, okay, paying lawyers to defend these things. Drastic reduction there. Settlements dropped from $3 million to $1.25 million a year. I mentioned a moment ago the Yale program for OBGYN. In the period of time, comparing 5 years before they had it was a multi-pronged safety improvement thing. The 5 years before compared with the 5 years after, their med mal payouts dropped by 95%, which is stunning. 95%, and that's OB. This is OB, which is the fiery pit of med mal. Okay, I mean, and because if a baby comes out badly, you're looking at a lifetime of medical exposure and needs and so forth. So that was the hot, fiery pit of med mal, okay? 95% reduction. It was just stunning. And so we have another example, and my lawyer colleagues need to get on board this as well. The plaintiffs' lawyers are on board, as a matter of fact. What Children's Healthcare of Atlanta did, and this was initiated by my wonderful colleague Dale Hetzler, who was the general counsel there, the head lawyer at a children's hospital in Atlanta. And what he does there and what he did there is, as soon as they know something went boo-boo or bump in the night, or maybe a plaintiff's attorney contacts them, what's been happening is, if it's an attorney, take him out to lunch and say, let's talk about it. And what he does, whether it's family, whether it's plaintiff's attorney, he promises, I will give you everything that's discoverable within 30 days. And then he does it. The medical records are discoverable. In other words, you have to share them when there's a lawsuit. So share them. I can say that I have seen on the legal side there's a lot of gamesmanship when it comes to discovery. Well, we'll give you these few little tidbits, and then we'll make you ask for the others, and then we'll give you a few more little tidbits, and then make you ask for more. Or the plaintiff side will give a major dump request. We want everything that happened on the planet in the last 20 years. I don't think I can do that. Can you refine your request? It's just nutty. I mean, the defense stuff gets nutty that way, and the plaintiff side gets a little crazy. So, okay. What they'll then have is follow-up meetings for negotiation. They've got their own folks in the hospital. The risk management team looks carefully into the error and gets a pretty good idea what would be a fair and appropriate resolution based partly on, the expenses that will be needed, the pain and suffering, and what the person might likely get in court. Okay? They figure out, all right, here's as much as we can handle. Then they'll negotiate on that basis. Now, importantly, if the hospital has not erred, they are going to defend it to the hilt. This is not a game of roll over and hand over the cash. Only if they realize they made a mistake and somebody got hurt does all of this get launched. Loads of hospitals are now on board with this in the United States in varying degrees. Lots and lots and lots of hospitals. So how and when to disclose, that is in many ways the more challenging issue. And there are many ways in which there is help. And one website, it's called sorryworks.com, has some thoughtful ideas about how and whether and when to disclose and this kind of thing. So, I don't want your apology. I want you to be sorry, says the wife to the husband. So the moral of the story is we really can do well and do better by doing the right thing. And I thank you for your attention. We have some time for Q&A. And I've got some more great videos if anybody wants to see them. If anybody has reflections that you would like to share, I'd be delighted to entertain them.
My question is whether, from your experience, do you think that this issue of disclosure is culture dependent, or does it change from one culture to another? Do you expect to have the same reaction from, let's say, families when something wrong happens?
What a perfect question. Yes, is this culturally, at least partly culturally dependent? I would have to imagine that there are cultural norms that need to be understood and appreciated, and that working one's way toward maybe the same final situation would certainly need to take account of cultural realities and what people expect, and maybe starting in smaller settings. And it can be, I don't know, I would love to explore your ideas on how best that would be achieved in a society that has different approaches to talking with each other about when things don't turn out well. And your own reflections, I would love to hear more about it, because this obviously is a story from the US. I have to think that at some point when something goes wrong, I think it's a fairly basic need to understand what happened. So how to navigate toward that understanding is the cultural issue. And I'm very open. I would love to hear thoughts about how one would do that.
Here in Lebanon, the medical establishment had for a long time pronounced the judgment on cases like this. So if you are a citizen and you have a certain thing, there is some misjudgment or error, you can either sue to the court or you can sue to the order of physicians. The order of physicians has the same power like the first degree court. Even when the case is raised in court, the court usually will ask the order of physicians to volunteer and do. And usually the order will collect some numbers or knowledgeable in discipline or the accident happened, and they send the final report. Now recently this has been changing. In fact, 2 days ago, the news of friends, after a complaint by parents, and together with he said, I don't want them to go to the doctors because the doctors tend to protect their health. And this is often said on the media that complaining to a technical group, to an establishment, they tend to hide information on protection of their belief. This is unfortunate in a way because also when you apply to medical establishment, if you're looking into the case, then this is a disservice to the institution of the individual who has been sued, because often enough lawyers try to desire to earn more money to get more compensation. They ignore that these things happen, that sometimes any treatment has certain unavoidable risks that should be recognized. And therefore, a physician will be more scientific, if you will, in the sense of producing a final judgment.
Yes, thank you. As you were describing this, I began to do some mental brainstorming. Because in some of our states, each state has its own way of addressing medical malpractice. It's not federal in the United States, it's state by state. And something that some states have is a medical tribunal. As kind of a first layer, that the medical tribunal would actually evaluate whether there is merit in the case or not, and then it might go or not go, and it might be simply an advisory opinion. And we also have concerns by families, well, aren't these doctors just going to protect each other? Circle the wagons and, you know, protect each other. That's kind of an expression from the Wild West, circle the wagons, like wagon train wagons. Anyway, what I'm sort of thinking about is what a lot of the hospitals do who are doing disclosure and offer is mediation. I'm a mediator, so I'm a great fan of mediation, where what you do is, and a variation of mediation is collaborative law, where each side brings its own representation, a lawyer who's on your side, on the doctor's side, but the lawyer's job is not to fight against each other. The lawyer's job is to represent each side working together collaboratively to come to a good resolution. And I'm just sort of trying to brainstorm a little bit what might fit in this kind of scenario. Suppose, for example, and I'm not recommending, just thinking out loud, suppose, for example, that you were to have a mediation session where you would have a neutral third party bring in an expert witness or two that both sides agree is credible and trustworthy to help inform as the provider side and the patient and family side try to come together to agree on something. I don't know if that would work or not. I'm just sort of thinking in response to your very thoughtful remarks, sir.
Well, I think for that to really happen, there has to be a class of lawyers like yourself who are not out there just to make the maximum out of this. You know, you see all these commercials on TV in the States and you've had the mesothelioma, you know, call us, and you know, maybe, is there any movement among the lawyers didn't create a special class of lawyers who can handle these cases, or should only be allowed to handle them with an approach similar to what you are doing?
Wonderful question, thank you. We are evolving in the United States. I will say that in disclosure and offer settings, the hospitals and the in-house attorneys who are familiar with this and who are on board have found, let's talk about the plaintiff side lawyers, the plaintiff's lawyers are on board with this. They're fine with it because in the US at least, plaintiff suits in medical malpractice typically, and in many other scenarios of personal injury, they are on what's called a contingency fee. They only get paid if they prevail or win something in settlement. And what this kind of arrangement means, practical nuts and bolts, what this means is that with early discovery, they get the whole medical record right off the top. They learn quickly not to bother with cases that they can't win. It's very expensive to launch a medical malpractice case. Easily 70,000 to 100,000 American dollars. That's a lot of Lebanese pounds, okay? Whoa, just to mount the case. So the plaintiff's attorneys, for the most part, are fine with this. Defense attorneys, it's harder for them because they're losing a lot of billable hours because there's not as much fighting. Another thing in the US that has led to this, and I should say on the side, I work with the American Bar Association, Health Law Section, Dispute Resolution Section, and another organization called the American Health Lawyers Association, with 3 different entities, committees within them who works on alternative dispute resolution in healthcare specifically. And one of the things that we are all working on is a lot of states now have enacted medical malpractice reforms that make it so difficult to sue that even legitimate cases, especially if they're smaller dollars, don't get compensated. They don't have a prayer. Because in order to file a malpractice suit, it's so expensive up front, you have to, as a plaintiff's lawyer, you have to be getting a lot of money coming in order to just offset the costs and then make some money on, for the plaintiff and for yourself on the side. And so that's somewhat of an incentive to get privatization of justice is what it's called. Your own legal system, in a sense, where you don't need judges and courts, where you can come to your own agreement, and that's fine within the civil justice system. People come to their own agreements all the time. So thank you.
I have one announcement and one question for you. The
All right.
announcement is we have been promised by Dr. Moran to give us a workshop on disclosure, so this will be announced soon, hopefully. The second thing I want to say is a question particularly because we have colleagues from the residency program. Often we have residents asking us, sometimes we see errors that are taking place and the person responsible for this error is an attending physician. When we talk to the attending physician to say anything about it, he or she says that, don't say anything, hush it, we deal with it amongst ourselves. They feel moral distress and they don't know what to do at this point. So what is your advice or take on this issue?
Things like that, residents and students, at least as much, are, as we put it in the States, at the bottom of the food chain, okay? They are in the most humble position. The institution itself, from the leadership on down, needs to, if this is going to happen, their perspective and position needs to be, we need to have a different error. Remember the escalator video? To transform our view of error, to try and use it to something helpful. And the elements of that are going to be things that I know your leadership is familiar with and probably would like very much to institute. And that has to do with to take a non-blaming approach to making mistakes. And anonymous reporting can be very helpful. And is really integral as part of that, at least for certain kinds of scenarios. And to be able to say, look, you're not going to be punished if you made a mistake. If all you did was misread something, that's not to be punished. But let's learn from it. Let's figure out how to make care safer. So that for the residents, they will be dependent on assistance from above. And I can appreciate where, our country, you saw that headline from the VA system and it said, how dare they not severely punish the pharmacist who made a mistake. We're still in that too. So I claim no moral superiority on that. We've just kind of taken a few little steps in what I think is a very good direction. And so we would be happy to stride with you in that. Thank you, Talia. And I have one thing here. This is, you mentioned lawsuits and the plaintiff, okay, and plaintiff's lawyers. This is from a plaintiff's law firm.
The pain was excruciating. It's like I had this huge, really sharp machete chopping down on me every time I tried to move. Reach my hand into my purse, machete. Running my fingers through my hair, machete. It was the worst paper cut I ever had. They made that paper way too sharp. Someone has to pay.
If you've been injured, call us. But keep in mind, you need to really be injured.
Thank you all. Another great one. They've got others too.